Welcome to the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium for the 27th April. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is the last in our first slate of colloquia that the Center for Interdisciplinarity has sponsored this year. There were 6 of them. These presentations are designed to celebrate high-quality interdisciplinary work that features the arts and humanities. The Center will continue to organize and sponsor these colloquia next year. Our plan is to have a slate of 6 in the fall and another 6 in the spring. Again, highlighting really exciting, innovative work that crosses disciplinary boundaries and involves the arts and humanities. We invite you, if you know of people you'd recommend as presenters in this series, to inform us of that. Don't hesitate to send me an email. My name is Michael O'Rourke, and we'll definitely be grateful for any suggestions you might have for us. Today, we're very lucky to have with us Professor Natalie Phillips. Natalie is Associate Professor of English, specializing in 18th century literature, the history of mind, and cognitive approaches to fiction. She is Director of the Digital Humanities and Literary Cognition Lab at Michigan State. She has also become a lead figure in the emerging field of literary neuroscience, pioneering a series of interdisciplinary experiments that use neuroscientific tools, including fMRI and eye tracking, to explore the cognitive dynamics of our engagement with literature, music, and art. And she's here with us today to talk a little bit about that and connect it up with interdisciplinary themes in a presentation entitled Literary Neuroscience, the Benefits of Interdisciplinarity. Natalie, thank you.
Hi. Hi, Ron. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Michael and to everyone involved for the invitation to speak. I do a lot, as you heard, I do a wide range of work, and I'm an English professor. And I specialize in 18th century studies, and my first book is on the history of distraction, particularly what people 200 years ago thought about distracted coach driving, for example, and attention spans in an age when print revolution was having everyone believing that things were becoming increasingly short, to the point where actually they were concerned they might not make it past the first page. But when I'm not doing that, today I'm going to be talking about the work that's at the intersection of that, and the work that I'm doing in this new field of literary neuroscience, where art and the humanities meet science daily on the ground. So as the name implies, this work is innately interdisciplinary, and obviously it invokes dealing with C.P. Snow, and to some degree, right? Because he famously describes the two cultures of humanities and sciences as being, right, separated by a gap of mutual incomprehension. And of course, my question for today is, in 2018, is that still true? Is that still relevant? And should we even be thinking in those terms? And I think we'll be able to say some reasons why or why not. And so, as I said, most of the time, at least in theory, I spend my time studying 18th century literature, particularly, as I said, the history of distraction. But what I do when no one's looking is put students in brain scanners and force them to read literature, particularly Jane Austen. So basically, what this involves is that it really involves moving in this unique interdisciplinary space where I speak both languages, often talking about Pride and Prejudice and activation in the prefrontal cortex in the same day. And obviously, this involves some chaos by its nature. Sorry, I'm just trying to move through my own talk presentation notes. There's some chaos here, but there's also inspiration and what I'll call productive dissonance going on. And since I'm the PI in English with co-PIs in neuroscience, psychology, music, cognition, and beyond. One of the main messages that I want to demonstrate today at a broadest level is to demonstrate that there's a way for scholars in the humanities of any sort to enter into productive dialogue with cognitive science, not by importing its technologies, raw, or merely like applying its insights, or in fact looking to neuroscience for answers or validation regarding the value of the humanities or literature, but in fact bringing the humanities to the sciences in order to shape its studies, reshape its methods, and produce a more reciprocal conversation about reading, our engagement with art and the mind, one that will actually produce radically, authentically interdisciplinary work with the emphasis on the inter, that kind of work that can in fact advance both fields. So this is the model I live by in my research, but also in my lab, the Digital Humanities and Literary Cognition Lab. And just for the record, anyone in the room who's from the lab, please take a second and stand up. Sorry, guys, calling you out. I guess that's fine. All right. So we're not able to get everyone here today. Obviously, we've rescheduled a few times, but part of what this work does is we have a model of hands-on research across the arts and sciences that I think has a sort of equally transformative power as the research in reshaping how we think about interdisciplinary education. And that's because we have students and faculty coming in from English, neuroscience, education, engineering, et cetera, and beyond. And we have over 25 students and faculty involved at this point. So I'll talk a bit more about that. So right now, we have 3 experiments, as I said, or as Michael said, going on in the lab. And I'm going to do something kind of crazy, so we'll see how it works. But I'm going to try to do little notes on all 3 with an emphasis on the last. And so the first is on the neuroscience of novel reading, a second, another on the pleasures of poetry, and a final on the stories that we hear in music. First funded by the business school and Cal, and then most recently funded by NSF. So here goes. Oh, sorry. And in addition, we also do accessible art outreach. I'll come back to that. All right, so in the first study, this is an fMRI study of literary attention and Austin, now known in the media as Your Brain on Jane. This is a collaboration between MSU, Stanford, and Sweden. We brought literature to neuroscience and ended up actually becoming the first fMRI study of real-time natural reading done at all. In other words, letting people read a real novel at their own speed inside a scanner. And so just to give you a little bit of detail about this, what this did, and it wasn't in fact about Jane Austen at all. I can answer questions about that, but in fact was it trying to explore the dynamics of 2 complex styles of attention that we can bring to reading a book, any book, close reading and pleasure reading. And here it was a chapter from Mansfield Park. Obviously pleasure reading, a more relaxed style of focus, as my picture clearly evokes, suggests that we can become more immersed in a story, or so to speak, lost in a good book. And if we like that book, that is. And I just want to point out, you can pleasure read anything. This could be Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, to a magazine. But close reading, as we know, instead asks us to shift attention to look at a novel or any literary work structure, paying attention to and trying to unpack and analyze key elements of characterization, plot, structure, et cetera, et cetera. And so in order to think about the power that this will do, and so basically what we wanted to do is actually test whether or not we could see differences in this. And so people went through 3 different stages in the experiment. First, they actually read the first chapter outside the scanner. Thanks, guys. Oh yeah, I think it will. Appreciate it, guys.
Yeah. Okay.
Dun, dun, dun. Cool. We'll see how it goes.
It's back. It's back.
All right. Anyway, here's how the study went, basically, just to give you a quick sense. First, we had literary PhDs come in to do the study. We had to eliminate professors entirely, it turned out, because they'd all forgotten how to pleasure read. Nobody was able to even identify what that meant anymore. And so I had to eliminate them. And I also needed a way to know that people had been trained in how to close read. And so without having to do incredibly intensive testing of numerous undergraduates, we ran through a fabulous solution, and we found that PhD candidates in English from Stanford, Berkeley, and San Jose State were perfect, and able to still, in fact, move between these two states of mind. I won't say with ease inside a scanner, but we're able to still do it. So first, right, they read the first chapter of Austin's Mansfield Park outside the scanner. And this was so we could so they could get used to her style, not have it be the first encounter inside the scanner. And two, so we could get a sense of how fast they read naturally, individually, normally, on an everyday basis, and see how much being inside the scanner distorted that reading time and adjust accordingly for each individual. Next, they go into the MRI where we're tracking blood flow. We were also able to use fMRI compatible eye tracking, one of the first labs to do that. So allowing us to track blood flow, eye movements, and also changes in heart rate and respiration as they read through the novel. And what they're doing here is, as they're moving through this second chapter, they're moving through the entire second chapter of Mansfield Park, they're moving between sections where they were asked to close read and other sections where they're asked to pleasure read, which were randomized. But basically, and at the end, they got out, and wrote a short literary essay on the sections that they close read. And so I think when I hit this, it's funny, I eliminated the slide that's sort of like the big bang payoff, in part because of the desire to stay interdisciplinary. There's one way to look at this study, which is to sort of look at the brain images and to say that what we saw is widespread global activation far beyond what was ever expected for close reading, thinking about this in terms of the value of the liberal arts, core skills taught that way. And part of my pushing away from, in thinking about interdisciplinary, there's a challenge in thinking about what it means to have a humanist brain image. So I'm denying you both sides of this, and I'm only going to say it orally. So I will not show you my beautiful brain images. But it's to say that we saw incredibly widespread and unique blood flow, and we're still exploring this for close reading, but also for pleasure reading, a distinctive and unique. And surprise number two, especially for me, considering that I was surprised anyone could read at all inside an MRI, is that when students got out at the very end to write that analytical essay, it turned out, and this is something that students in the lab discovered because they just became interested, people were quoting directly from Austen's novel by memory, at length, often accurately, and particularly with a strong focus on the sections that they had just close read, which were simply demarcated with a nice little text box in red. So this, to me, is absolutely astonishing, and we have over, I think, 188 quotes coming from our 18 subjects. And so that's part of, I'll leave that for Q&A to even begin to discuss the implications of that. But it means that you begin to have a sense of both the shared patterns governing capturing attention and memory, right, when novel reading over time, and also be able to look at each person's individual and unique response to that literary work as well, because we're able to track both. So that's what got me involved. So then I learned something, which is that I hadn't just done a bad PubMed search on MRIs of novel reading, which is what I thought, that we did become the first fMRI study of novel reading. And so thus I was invited to join this global collaboration at NYU, bringing together lead figures in the neuroscience of art, music, and literature to design a whole series of interdisciplinary experiments. And so we joined the literature group, but it was a group of both humanities and group of humanists and scientists all together working towards this common goal. And that was something that I was very excited about, but also very, very challenged by. There was a moment in our meetings when they tried to actually separate out who fit in which group. Right, the humanists in one section and the scientists in another, and someone joked because I stood very awkwardly in the middle, and when asked, when one of the cognitive scientists said, well, of course she belongs over here, the humanist said, no, she's over in your group, right? And so this suddenly begins to actually lived on the ground challenge some of this. So the poetry study. All right. So in our next project, we move from novels to poetry, exploring what moments in literature people love or hate, maybe not so strong, as they're reading. And we're currently moving this project into the scanner, which means that we're bringing these literary questions about what we enjoy, what we find pleasing, not just what we find sort of pretty or beautiful, but actually like a powerful, pleasurable, or moving. That could be something negative in topic. But again, bringing these literary questions to cognitive science pushed us again to create new experiments and models for using this technology, MRI. In this case, a program that allows individuals to highlight and then also view their own responses to this poem in real time inside the scanner as they're going. And so this is building on a behavioral study, but it will let us analyze them. And I think you can start to get the sense of the implications of this because it keeps returning us from the science, right, back to the individual and the personalized and the unique human response to each text, and lets us analyze them. So this is all building on a previous behavioral study where we had 30 English majors highlighted parts of a poem. The parts of a poem, in this case, there's 16 poems, but in this case, they're highlighting the parts they like most in green, and the moments they like least in red. And obviously, right in the scanner, that will be in real time, allowing us to pull out that data. So here's that's just one case. And here is an image of how you can begin to see, and this is not, we actually ran into a problem because, right, when you hit when you see moments when people really, really love the same moments in a text, it's surprising to see that kind of convergence in people's enjoyment. Right, when over somewhere between 21 and 24 people out of your 30 are all liking the same word or phrase, we could no longer stay in that dark color of green. It covered up the text and you couldn't see it anymore, requiring us to develop some new visualization tools. But again, this lets us think about the patterns of attention and pleasure, in this case, or displeasure, that are shaping the act of reading and the ebb and flow of the complex emotions, which are not obviously just green or red, but begin to tap into these kinds of questions at a level that reader response theory, I think, hasn't yet been able to give us purchase on to date. So, and I'll just say that as it turns out, some of the things that people have been drawn to tend to be things like metaphors and personification, alliteration, and I don't have examples here, but also difficulty and uncertainty, it turns out at times. And we often like to talk or complain. I don't know how many English professors are in the room, but most people don't think to themselves about the things that students most love, being sonnets. Or difficult parts of literature in general, or art. But I was delighted and intrigued to see people actually marking with high frequency moments that they profoundly enjoyed, not only things that were quite negative in tone, right? Passages about war, right, or violence, but that they found profoundly moving, but also moments where it was very profoundly unclear what the poem meant. All right. And finally, one day I was at a conference trying to actually keep a low profile. It was on music cognition, and I was approached by somebody who had figured out that I did work in narrative neuroscience, so is called now, who had done a work on the stories that we hear in music. And so I'll talk about that. How much time do I have, Michael? How are we on? Huh? Another? Okay, let's see how well we can do this. And I just want to say for the record, this one I do not see this entering a brain scanner, in case we are starting to think that this work is limited this way. So one of the commonplaces of thinking about music, which I hope we all would suspect a little bit, is the idea of music being the universal language of mankind. But of course, the question is, even though it may speak to us in similar ways, no one seems to speak the language well enough for us to be able to talk to one another in music or, right, converse in some sort of meaningful way. And thus, right, and obviously I'll be a little bit more hardcore for a second, right? Because of course, lacking in explicit semantics, music cannot denote specific sequences of events, but right, it can still communicate meaning to an audience and a group of listeners to some degree, right? And to an audience from diverse backgrounds, cultures, and languages, question mark, right? And so this is an interesting question to consider because also individuals engage with music in radically different ways, both personally and culturally. And here's where I'm going to bring in the literature example because I'm the English professor. And so this variety in our styles of listening to music, I think, is beautifully captured in E.M. Forster's Howard's End. So in this particular moment in the text, oh good, it's over there too. Wow, it's the first time I saw that. Sorry. So basically, this is cataloging different characters' responses listening to Beethoven's Fifth. So one character taps the beat, another holds the score full to their face. But the most interesting style of listening for us, and I think in general, is that of the heroine, Helen. She actually hears heroes and shipwrecks, right, in the music's flood. And this, sort of from a humanities perspective, is, I think, an interesting prompt for thinking about this study. Because how music communicates meaning to listeners has been a long-standing topic of interest, but really very little is known about the cognitive processes that lead it to create meaning. And there have been tons of studies done on emotional responses to music and all of this, but no one to date had done a project actually looking at whether or not there were narrative responses to music. And so while I'd like you guys actually to have a moment and pull out a piece of paper if you have one. And I'd like you to ask yourself, while listening to this, a question. And it's, while listening to the music, do you hear a story or elements of a story? And if so, write down any elements. And if not, write down why not. And hopefully, I have audio that will play. Just trying to find the perfect place to try to cut it off, where it was not going to annoy you. Right, so again, I'll ask at the end. We'll return to this question. But this question is precisely what the woman who totally accosted me at the music Cognition was asking students at the University of Arkansas. 47 students, right? And they were eight 90-second clips of orchestral music without words. Like the one you just heard. And people were asked if they heard, right, a story, elements of a story. And as it turned out in her study, right, approximately almost 60% of people were describing themselves as hearing a story. And when, this is what hooked me, there was up to 88% similarities of the stories aligning around similar themes to a degree. Basically, we were hooked. So I'll once we got a hold of the narratives at UArkansas, we got to see the trends in a little bit more detail. And I apologize for the sizing of this. There should be like a table here, and I decided to blacken it. But in this case, you see an unthinkable number, and these are just 5 samples, of Tom and Jerry, cat and mouse, sort of chase themes. And the fact that these narratives were so similar had us raising deep questions about where was this coming from? Is this starting to align based on, is this just the University of Arkansas? Were they all just watching Tom and Jerry? Right, Prokofiev, by the way, what you just listened to, predominantly, in many cases, about battle and war with medieval armies. Right, you can't always follow a single word like battle because it can shift to warfare. But again, there can be armies and battles, landscapes, and the one that hit 88%, where in fact 88% of the stories were in fact about a ballroom, a dance, or a royal wedding that involved people dancing. So I wanted to know whether or not this was just Arkansas, and so we brought it over to MSU, and I pulled out excerpts from those stories over at University of Arkansas, and thought to myself, all right, let's see whether or not people can actually match it back, take the narratives, do the opposite, not just see whether or not people are going to respond the same way, but actually see if, by just reading some sample narratives, whether you can pick the right piece of music. I'm going to give you 8 pieces of music. You've got these little narrative samples. Can you match them back? And I know. And so it shouldn't have gone well, right? This should not have been an easy task, people not being able to read one another's minds or read the minds of students at Arkansas they don't even know. And then they only actually had 4 narrative samples out of the 8. So they were not able to use process of elimination. And yet, we had 77% accuracy, and I had a more detailed graph, but I was trying again not to use too many graphs, share whatever. And there are certain pieces that have it higher or lower, and I can get into that as well. But 77% accuracy for the reverse now narrative to music matching study, which I found absolutely delightful, so wild. So also, we began to run, then hit NSF. And we have thus, since then, we've collected more stories than I can count. And we began to look, and of course in that original study, the number of people that said they were hearing a story was right at approximately 60%. Now, in this case, now we're up to approximately 77% of people hearing narratives. And again, I just wanted to think back about, thinking that music may just evoke a sort of emotion in us, or a sort of more abstract feeling, or right, whatever we thought when we thought about that universal language. And imagine how that might change if we actually start to think that people are hearing stories, actual stories as they're listening, and that may be what's prompting the emotion. I'm going to remain agnostic till the study is done. But again, yes, thanks to support from Cal and the business school and other things, this led to the first NSF grant. So we're currently in it. And part of what this experiment does is it's asking, not only does it cross colleges, right, like Arkansas and MSU, but cultures. And so in particular, we have a question about large-scale culture, but I want to make a quick reference. We're collaborating with a group in China. We're gathering sets of short excerpts from Chinese music, as well as Western music, and they'll be cross-tested, and we'll have listeners. A special group, one of the special collaborators up there. Oh, didn't make it. One of the collaborators is from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, specializing in ethnomusicology, as well as music cognition, et cetera. So he's going to travel supposedly to regions of rural China that would have the least amount of exposure to Western music to do this testing. And we will be gathering responses from, it's a reverse study, so basically we'll be collecting responses from students or participants at MSU to both sets of musical samples, starting to ask the question, in other words, is this all about people watch, because of course for me, sorry, I'm going to just go back, because of course for me, one of the questions was, as we collected the stories, we saw, and I would say the students in the lab, and that, there are so many, but began to see all these pop culture references, right, in the stories. And many of the stories we collected reference pop culture, or in particular, we have an actual map of it, and it does have a nice little hub right around Disney. there's Fantasia, Disney Princess, Tom and Jerry, Nutcracker, right? And so a lot of people do definitely tend to be superimposing culture onto this. And so part of that larger scale question right here is whether or not we're going to see the same thing. And so just for fun, before we're totally done, I'll give you a sense of some of the narratives that we're getting. This is a little bit for entertainment, but not entirely. I'm not even going to let you read it all. As you can see, they vary, right? This is demonstrating a sort of theme, but it's also raising a key question, right? One, how in the world do you decide what it means to have a similar narrative? What does that actually mean at all? And this, of course, is a central topic in digital humanities and in literature. And this is beyond even asking what is a story, because we should be asking ourselves that as well, I hope. But right, how in the world, even if I'm pulling in, right, we can see the encountering the fearsome creature in the dark, and certain themes, but this would not be caught, right, by simple word count like I was using at the beginning. And so that is the question that we are exploring in depth right now in the lab, and across, it'll be actually over many, more than thousands of samples. So right now, some of the ways, and it means that there will be more stories than we can read. Right, it will reach that point. So it will be always at this place where it will be relying on making the tools grow out of humanistic analysis and rich analysis of the music as well. We have the team of musicologists on the other side. But right now we're thinking that the best ways to go are to think about topic and theme, setting, mood, by way of sentiment analytics, complicated. But thinking about plot structure by way of trying to isolate events through isolating key verbs, and characters, and as far as we can go. But again, the challenge that NSF didn't touch, sorry, you are video recording this, aren't you, was that I was still shocked that they didn't, is of course the fact that they had lots of questions about the music and the music cognition side, but nobody seemed concerned about how in the world we were going to look for narrative similarities between stories that were written in English and in what was assumed then to be Mandarin, but will not be Mandarin. It will be a variety of dialects from the regions they'll be being collected in. And so we're looking forward to possibly designing a study here at MSU, thinking about bilingual listeners and having students actually write responses in Chinese and then translate it in English themselves. I'll take suggestions. That was the most recent. But just as a final point, in addition, we're actually developing a crowdsourcing tool where you can, in fact, and you should be able to go there now if you would like, adagia.org. It is so not actually set up very well, but you can do it. And you can listen to any piece of music. They're randomly playing currently. It's I think there are 8 Western and 8 Chinese samples up right now. This is a tempo mapping graph, but basically what this allows people to do is actually, allows us to do is pull it out of the lab setting, pull it out of the, techno setting, not outside the MRI in this case, but it actually allows researchers to, we can have individuals participate and then they can immediately see their own narratives on this GPS-based and geospatially located map. And again, letting us, and that would be both located and time-stamped. And individuals in the long run would also be able to add their own pieces of music and have those tested at. So obviously the next step is getting to China, but I wanted to come back to the lab and say finally that I think that none of this work would have happened. This is not my work, so to speak. I don't think of it as Natalie's research or as Phillips's research. This is the research of my lab, and that relies on that rich interdisciplinary group that I mentioned. As you might imagine, a single human, or even a single human working with a bunch of collaborators, could never have touched this many studies in a row and been an 18th centuryist and written a book, right? And it's been the drawing on points that just capture their interest. A student became really interested in metaphors, right, and what people were highlighting in the poems, and that grew into its own research project. And just the very way that students interact in the lab is something that I find both beautiful, and it's what motivates me to continue to do this work at all. And to say finally that we don't just do scientific experiments, but also outreach. And you may have noticed when I walked in at the beginning, there's both a rolling walker and a cane behind it. And this is because I am on the disability spectrum and have intermittent episodes of vertigo, one of which let me take a very solid crash across the English department hallway yesterday night. And so I can see most of you, but there may be 2 or 3 of you today. But part of our interest in this is, before this even occurred in my life, there was a student who he became a Marshall Scholar, but a triple major in English, neuroscience, and he's let me get it right, chemical and molecular biology, I think, who ended up also wanting to do creative writing and outreach. And so there's a student-run journal called Exceptions that showcases creative work by, for, and about people along the visual disability spectrum. And so one of the central events has become an accessible art outreach event in which students in literature write poems or select pieces of work that they think involve multi-sensory imagery, and then pass those along to artists who then translate those into tactile artworks. Translate's not the right term, right? Use that as the inspiration to develop, right, works that are meant to be touched, to be experienced through touch or sound or any sorts of things. And so this has become a central component of our work, and I was delighted to meet a new collaborator now in medical humanities who is doing this kind of work and is excited to think about how to make art accessible across the disability spectrum. Not only that, but then also scientific results, thinking about how to use art to visualize science. And her name's Devin Stahl, and she's been taking MRI images of her own brain, slices, and having her sister translate them into artworks. And so we're considering using that as, thinking about how to render that accessible. In other words, could you have a tactile image of a brain? How would you represent different regions of activation, things like this. Anyway, so moving into new territory. So basically, I think this is just the point where I say thank you for your time, and to say that that I hope in standing here and in doing this, I think that there's a style of thinking about disciplinarity where it is assumed that to do this research, like for me to have a brain image, and that's why I didn't give you one, would be to impose the sciences on the humanities. But I think it's equally important to realize that someone like me, who had no previous background in cognitive science, can learn. I was to the point where I now am able to fully run any subject inside the MRI scanner, right, and conduct all of this type of research. And then in addition, right, so that's the interdisciplinarity of lived, to have that working on the ground in a lab, right, where students from all sorts of disciplines are working together on shared projects and contributing shared knowledge. And finally, to just think and to wonder about those two cultures, and to ask whether or not that's a division that's still productive to be discussing, or whether lived reality can start reshaping it, to think about also that, what we traditionally define as the humanities can in fact reshape the sciences. With that. Questions, I hope.
So I'm wondering if narrative listening is caused by the fact that you're prompting with, do you hear a story?
Oh, absolutely. So that was my first question too, actually. That was the question I had before I agreed. or like before I agreed to write the NSF grant. I'll put it that way. I looked at the stories before I agreed to write the NSF grant. So before we did that, we did an implicit priming study. Sorry, how many people in the room, so this is not to pull a two cultures moment, how many people in the room would define themselves as working within a scientific discipline of some sort? Okay, I'll translate better. All right, so basically we did a study where we took the most frequently used words that we were finding in terms of the similarity, like the ballroom, the battle, the army, whatever, and basically did a word response time test to those words as compared to words with like the testably similar syntactic difficulty, complexity, and non-relationality. Did I translate that well enough? I can't think of the examples of those other words, but I'm like, ballroom is to whatever else. And we were able to show that while listening to the piece of music, without being asked anything about any stories at all, people were responding faster to the words that had come through as the similar terms in the study than to these other terms, regardless of difficulty, regardless of reference. So that at least had me, I was like, all right, I'm ready to deal with this. But what I find interesting, and the reason that this, that Lisa Margulis, my collaborator, started to do the study is because she started out doing this. She's a music cognition person. She teaches intro to music classes, and when people were just asked to describe a piece of music, she noticed that people with music training were immediately into the woodwinds and the tempo and the volume. I come from like a background of half concert pianist and half test pilot. So that's my world, right? I listen to a piece of music. I don't think I hear a story, but for people without musical training, she was seeing more and more often just this narrative component. And so I think that there's a strange phenomenon, though, where if you just ask people to describe their experience of that piece of music, you don't access whatever this is, right? People tend to either be like intimidated or say nothing at all. We ran that too. It was like, just describe, how, I don't know, what you were thinking. We did variations on this, but it's hard to capture. And so we were willing to take this risk in order to try to isolate the phenomenon that we think we're seeing, but you get the point. Yeah, if you ask people to describe, they're like, it got louder. There were some things like horns, I think, right, without musical training. And so you don't access this other component, which is a tough one, but yeah, real. Yeah.
I have a question related to that about the superimposition of pop culture that you talked about. I think moving this study, doing a cross study or this, I don't know how you termed it.
Yes. I don't know. I think of it as endless branches. It just keeps going, right?
So having people in China listening to Western music, having Westerners listen to Chinese music, that will be really helpful because the fact that you've got a core references to Disney, I wonder how many American university students' first exposure to classical music is through Disney. And so
this was immediately I was like,
so people are pre-programmed to give you the narratives that they already know.
I was calling it the Fantasia effect, right? I mean, right, but it is. And so what was interesting to me was that I was really so hooked on this that I actually went through the example with the Tom and Jerry, and we found, there is a cat concerto. And I played that for students, and they didn't hear any cat and mouse chases at all. And I went, God damn. Because I was sure, right, that this is a pop culture phenomenon. And I don't think in other words, I actually don't think that this cross-cultural test is going to disprove it either. I think that what excites me is the fact that since we're gathering this rich qualitative data, that we'll be able to look at just how many and what kinds of pop cultural references are being made by people across right, across this wide range, across thousands and thousands of stories, right, and to begin to map them and web them. And a future project is to actually look at, they're going to be looking at key patterns within the music, so contrast, tempo change, rhythm change, all of this, how that affects different story elements. But sorry, I'm going to lose my train of thought, sorry. But basically, there are actually online databases where you can get indie music. You need to find, if you're an independent filmmaker and you don't have a ton of money to get background music, you need to be able to find something that's not copyrighted. And there are databases where you can enter in a type of scene that you would like, and they'll spit out a piece of music that you could use as background. And so what I would like to do at the end of this, when all of the purely NSF scientific theories have been articulated regarding the so-called universality or not of the musical, of narrative listening, this cognitive response and our intersections, and go in and be like, let's just see how similar those pieces are to the ones that, we're being listened to, and do a layer of cross comparison. And that's what I guess I'm always bringing as a humanist, is that layer of not just skepticism, but of let's add more richness to this. Let's think about how we can use our cultural awareness of film and that instinct to enrich an already rich study that was praised by the NSF for its interdisciplinary team. And I was like, who are you? Hi, NSF. Yeah.
I was curious if you could just talk a little bit more about your goals with the crowdsourcing tool. Kind of what are you planning? Where do you want that to go?
That was interesting because I would like for it to be incredibly open-ended. There's a style, I would like it to become a tool that could become popularized, and people would just would add their own pieces of music, would become curious about the narratives. Who knows, right? I'm not sure how you invite people to get hooked on an app called Adagia, but the idea being that, of course, just taking Western music and comparing it to China is profoundly limited, and that this is a way to use DH tools, right, and interweave them in a way that really pulls it out of the lab space, right, and gets more immediate, more natural reactions from a whole variety of individuals across places, across times, across cultures, hopefully. And then in addition, what's neat is that our ultimate goal, and comically I'll be applying for a summer DH fellowship about this, so the goal is actually to make the tool something where anyone could go in and create a project where they could collect similar data. So just like I showed you an example where you were seeing some signals of like a heartbeat that's for tapping data. Somebody's interested in the rhythms, how the rhythm of how we just keep time, our natural presumed beat moving through the world changes, whether you live in, let's say, New York City or in, I don't know, I'm doing terrible stereotypes like Southern Georgia or something like this, but or based on time of day or recent experience. I'm sure mine would be very fast right now because I'm giving a talk. But that shows you if it can be used to study both someone's preferred tempo, so to speak, and narrative responses to music, and it's able to accommodate video, audio, and I know at least pictures, audio, and text responses right now. And so the goal would actually be to broaden it so that any researcher could use this tool to gather data of interest and be able to interact with it and have it still be interfacing. I know, lots of options. Yeah.
Yes, I want to go back to the topic of how many people have actually heard stories in music.
Yes.
And the first question is I have several questions. I'll go one by one.
I understand.
The first one is when they, the students, they provide the story. This is what this is my narrative while listening to the music. Did you ask why? What prompted you to?
Yeah.
Because I link it to emotions. It's an emotion. I think I did
This is the next step.
I listened to the music. I wrote what I saw, what I thought.
Right.
It was nothing. But it was something else, but it's fine.
Yeah, no, that's
So
good.
I'll try-
Great.
I'll be happy to share with you.
I'm delighted.
Yes,
No,
so-
that's the
and
best
I'm
thing
another
is.
generation too. So but it triggers an emotional response,
Yeah.
and from there I go into
Yeah.
the narrative.
Because you've
That is
been
why I-
prompted, right.
Exactly. That is why I asked if you ask, or I don't know, people in your team ask the students, why did you come with this? You know, what
Yeah.
triggered that?
What triggered it? We haven't yet. That's beautiful, and I've been pushing it ever so slightly. They get the question if they didn't. So I don't think it's fair that only people who don't hear stories are prompted to ask why they didn't, and not those who are asked why they did. Scientifically speaking, I think it's absolutely grounded and valid. So it hasn't yet happened, but it's coming. I promise. And in addition, I mean, this is the scientific side of it. I'll give you at least what we do have is that I'm gonna say wow, you're watching me have an interdisciplinary struggle. We are working on this is my fiance as well, gosh. We are working on a psychological survey to see if we can develop a narrative set of scaled questions on a scale of 1 to 7 that do not involve the rich qualitative responses I would like to receive all the time. Gather them at the end, but where questions are asked like, did you hear? Oh, someone help me. Did you hear music? Did the story emerge while you were listening, or did it only happen at the end? How easy or hard was it for you to think of a story? There are a lot of questions about emotion, about positive or negative feeling, intensity of that feeling, whether or not the negative feeling was good or bad. Anyway, it's very hard to scale all of that on a scale of 1 to 7, I think. So, but one of the interesting things is that they are clustering into these factor groups, where in fact 7 of the questions or so do tend to predict whether or not people respond, yes, I heard a story, or no, I didn't. And so people who tend to think more abstractly in terms of abstract images or colors, or predominantly, and the motion ones get complex, but don't say that I only heard the story, or at the end, or anything like it, tend to say no. And there's a whole cluster of things associated with those who say yes. But this is very, very early beta testing stage. We're just starting to gather the narratives. I think we have 800, 900 now, something like that. But it will be continuing on for another 2.5 years.
So in that sense, why not asking first to the person, listen to this, what do you think, or what do you feel first?
Yes.
And then a second question.
A second
question would be, do you hear a story? Yeah. It's
this is, oh gosh, it's a question of how honest to be. Okay, well, we may not be able to release this one. Okay, so this is where being a humanist in an interdisciplinary team rubber hits the road. So I'll let you know, I had to fight like nobody's business just to get the stories this round. People just wanted to actually do the surveys and then just have people answer yes or no. Did you hear a story, yes or no? And I was like, how is that measuring narrative listening? If it's not the narratives, it's not the narrative listening. You can't have a narrative engagement scale. Anyway, we all came to terms, but there was a long fight over whether they would put the story at the beginning or at the end. And we actually again came to an agreement that we would have it both ways. So actually, it's randomized. So half of the people get a space to put their story at the beginning before they answer any of these questions, and half of these people will get it at the end. And we're actually now comparing what that's doing to the stories and how long they spend on the stories because they're tired after answering those 33 questions. And that's one of the challenges, is that the goal of this first year of NSF, now that I'm part of an NSF team, right, is to establish, right, a baseline of preliminary. We gotta work out which nobody's asked this yet, which pieces of music are we going to pick? Right, so it's still in that stage where we're really just narrowing and trying to come up with a scale, a set of reasonable questions, and engage exactly. Thank you for reinforcing that. I feel like, would someone be willing to help me take a note on that? For asking that question about why, because I'm going to push that harder again. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
I think the idea of like thinking about the different sort of elements that are involved in producing, some sort of story response to music, right? Different layers like emotional response and conditions, what images we select or so forth. It makes me think of work that a colleague of mine, the previous university, was doing that involved comparing reactions that people would have to movies with different scores.
Oh, yes.
Right, so the same movie, so what he focused on, at least initially, was 2001.
Okay.
So Kubrick would apparently make his movies with temp scores. The studios would commission scores from famous composers. Yeah. But Kubrick would cut his movies initially with temp scores. And so 2001, the score that everybody knows is Kubrick's temp score. But the studio actually commissioned a score from somebody else whose name I'm forgetting, some famous.
And the result was that people responded who were unfamiliar with Kubrick.
What's that?
Did they look at how people who were unfamiliar with Kubrick, they preferred the?
Well, so the test was to take the score that was commissioned and take scenes from the movie and play and run the scene with the score that you know, and then run the scene with the commission score, right? So the way that the studio might have wanted it to.
And did they all watch the same?
And then compare the kind of reaction that you would have to that scene. So there's a really famous scene in that film where they're flying across the moon and there's the score. The temp score involves music from a composer by the name of Ligeti, I think. And it's so different than with the commission score and that score. It's just like a completely different experience. Same video, right? Same images, but just anyway. I'm not sure if that's how.
No, it is. It's incredibly relevant because, of course, right. This is part of the question and the implications, right. Part of the reason the business school was excited was like, oh well, if we can work out what kind of pieces of music inspire certain sort of story reactions, we can. Right, better approach film, music, and ad industry, and it's like, oh, yikes! But that this is exactly the kind of question I think that would become testable at a level that is, I think, again, that has that kind of cross-pollination where the scenes are so rich, right? There's so many factors going into that, down to like the tempo of what actions are happening at different points, right? And now every time I watch anything, I note that, if someone plays a certain type of music, I'm like, oh, something bad might happen, but it won't be that bad, and it's not happening soon. Like, I've started to cross-test myself, but just how fine-tuned our responses are and how easily we are right? How fast that story response does come. And so I think that test is a perfect example. One of the things that my collaborator did that I thought was very interesting, though, was that she did a test of emotional enjoyment. This is sort of to come back to like the 18th century aside, but like program music and right. And she actually looked at people's aesthetic pleasure responses to exactly the same piece of music with and without program notes. And she did a variety of different program notes. Some of them were, she had tons of different people write them. And to everyone's chagrin, people disliked the music more when they had notes. That was not her desired result. It wasn't really anyone's desired result. Everyone's like, everyone's like, wow, shoot. But one of the things that we found that made her excited about that again was realizing that, well, part of that might be because it doesn't match what they're, like, if you're told what you're supposed to hear, and then you actually start to create this this alternate story in your mind based on the music that not consciously, right? Not as like, I certainly wouldn't sit there, I would be more like the person in E.M. Forster, like with the, piece out on my knees, I'll totally admit it, right? Or tapping. But if there's that dissonance, perhaps that's what's causing the decrease in aesthetic pleasure. And if so, that's interesting because it's about the variety, not necessarily the similarity of the stories. It's about each person's unique response, and that when you try to guide it or constrain it, that it reduces the overall enjoyment. Yeah.
I feel like you're going to hate this question.
Oh no, go for it.
I'm really curious. I found your emphasis on dismissing of charts and graphs, and you don't want to show this. It's intriguing. I think you're leaning towards the Cartesian, maybe historically esoteric idea behind these.
That's true.
But I'm also wondering whether, especially from an interdisciplinary lens, if we're also thinking about representation and what makes this representation matter over that one, especially when you talk about thinking about these findings in terms of art, right? So text, music, art, graphs. So could you explore your thinking behind that? And
I'll be mean to myself for a second. So as you saw me flip through about 10,000 slides, I didn't put this up in part. Oh, now it's not even in. Let's see, slideshow play from. You know what? I'll be frank. No, you can. Thank you. You should come to the lab. You're helping me say what I wanted to say and didn't have time to do. I didn't want to put up a brain image and not be able to dig into what it means to have a humanist brain image. It wasn't that I was trying to deny you all the graphs. I also just didn't know how to handle all the graphs and all the explanations for all the studies and actually say anything meaningful and get to the music study where I want the most input. But no, the charts and graphs are actually part of, right, and this is one individual brain image, right, which is unique because I also want to make sure that it's clear that that's one person, not our collected data. But right, we're seeing a heightened activation in this case for close reading in the in the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex, and the blue is representing for that individual regions that show heightened activation for pleasure reading. And that's the only one where we have brain images. I don't happen to have in this particular slideshow that I intentionally downloaded just in case. Right, there were questions about more of the data. So here's the sort of humanist version of the quoting data. But here's our data on the percentage of people that are quoting reliably in close reading sections. There should be p-scores with some of this. And here's some of the graphs of different patterns of attention in terms of quoting from different sections of Chapter 2 of Austin's Mansfield Park, as people are moving in randomized groups through 32 chunks. Anyway, so in other words, I didn't do it because I'm tired, which isn't, or because it's hard to get it in. So I went for breadth rather than that. But I don't know. I'm really glad you asked the question, because I guess this is a question for you. Do you think that I should get that brain image up. But do you think there is such a thing as a humanist brain image?
From my own research, I don't know what that means, right? If we really push it to the limits that we want to when thinking about conflating these two disciplines,
Good.
I don't know what that new language becomes.
Me neither. Yeah, that's why I didn't do it. But I should have, because that's actually where I am. Because I no longer separate these worlds so much, even as you watched me internally struggle to say we around a specific kind of survey question. And I haven't talked at all about my 18th century research, right, in literary history of mind, which is already pushing me over into the quote unquote scientific side of my work, which I believe in its own right is in fact profoundly and innately interdisciplinary. But out of respect to that recognition came this, but also out of, we have all this, we have some p-values in Cohen's d and things like this, and the data is really cool. But yeah, PowerPoint slide editing, man. I can run I can run an MRI really well, but as you could see, I you know, some days I don't know how to use my own computer. So I believe in it as much as you do. Yeah, no dualism, I promise.
We should probably
Embodied.
bring this to a close.
Absolutely. Thank you for the fantastic questions. You guys.